The first thing we want to do, as we do with all components, is import React. But we also want to import React DOM from the React DOM package. And I have a feeling we're going to need some CSS styling with our modal. So I'm going to create a CSS file as well for our modal before I forget. And we're going to go ahead once again and make sure that I create a new file, modal.css, and make sure that I use a semicolon. Perfect. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we actually need to bind this modal. Remember, we created another div component that we can bind to using React DOM because it's going to be completely separate from our app component. Let's do that. Let's say const modal root is going to equal document.get element by ID. And we're going to grab the modal root element. I think that's what we called it. And now we have access to this element on our index.html page. Now here's the fun part. We're going to create our modal that extends React.component. Nothing new here. We've done this before. We also want to export it. Now in here, this is where it gets tricky. We want to have our regular constructor, and we want to accept props, call super, so we can use the this keyword. And in here, I want to have a reference to something called an element. And this element is going to be document.create element div. And don't worry, I'm going to explain what that does. And again, going forward with this modal, it might get a little bit confusing if this is your first time seeing this code. Again, React has really, really good documentation, so you can go and you'll see some of this code on their website because it's the recommended way to do modals. So you might have to play around with it a couple of times, but you will get used to it, I promise. Now, what we want to do first is we want to render the modal. And the way we do this when we use a portal is we say return React DOM dot create portal. In here, it's going to accept two parameters. It's going to accept this dot props dot children, whatever is inside of the modal component. And it's also going to accept this dot element, the element that we've just created, a div element. And the final piece of the puzzle is to create a component did mount that when the modal is open, we want to attach to the modal root, that is the index.html file. We want to append child element. So we're adding this element, a div element, to the modal root. And this div element is going to be wrapped around whatever we put inside of this modal component. It's children. We also want to be careful with modals because they do close and we want to exit out of them. We don't want to leave any junk behind on our index.html file. We can clean up after ourselves by doing component will unmount, or I guess no capital M there. And within here, we simply say modal root dot remove child this dot element. Oh, and I have to do this dot element here too, again, because we're referencing the element. Save. And that's it. We've just created a modal. I know this can get a little bit confusing, But think of it as a standard way to create modal in React. All we're doing is creating a portal, a nice little method that comes with React DOM, and it's going to unmount when we remove it. It's going to append some HTML for us when we mount it. I'm also going to add a little bit of a CSS just to make sure that the modal pops out and we see it properly. I'm going to use the ID of modal root that we have in the HTML file and give it a position of relative and a z index of 999. So to make sure that it's at the very front of all the other elements. So just going to save that, go back to modal.js. And now if we go back to app.js, where we've already imported our modal, we can test this out by using the component. So let's scroll down all the way down to where we're rendering. And perhaps just on the main page, just for fun, say modal. And remember, it accepts children, so I'm just going to say hello and close up the modal. Let's save. Hello is not defined because it has to be a string. Let's go back. And where is this modal? If I open up my developer tools, let's go to elements, or let's use React developer tools. I see that there's app, but I don't see my modal, do I? If I go to the elements plane, I see that I have ID modal root. Oh, I have a div. Okay, but there's nothing really in it except for the div. And we need to do a few things here to actually get the modal to work. Let's go back. The first thing we want to do is, well, we want to be able to open this modal and toggle it on and off. And because that's a pretty big functionality, let's add it to the very top of app.js, where we have our state, and create a new state called isProfile open. And we'll set it as false for now. And now we can pass this down as props to whatever component we want. So let's just add this as isProfile open to our state. And within the navigation, before we actually even check if our route is home, let's move this up and do something like this. Use a JavaScript expression by wrapping it in curly brackets, then saying isProfile open, and if it is, render the modal. Otherwise, we can say null. Another easy way of doing this, and it's actually a lot cleaner, is to use end. And this is a little shorthand. By doing this, let's line this up a little bit better so we can see better. I'm saying if isProfile is true, then keep going and render the modal. IsProfile open if false, then, well, that's going to error out. So it's not even going to go to the modal and read it. So this is a shorthand way of doing if you want to do a ternary operator where the last option is just null. All right, and in here, in the modal, let's create another component. And we'll call this component profile, because this is where we want the profile to be displayed. And this profile will get the isProfile open state. Let's save. And we get profile is not defined because we need to define it. But before we do that, I want to do one little thing. I also want to actually use isProfile open to toggle the modal, to either turn it on off, mounting it or unmounting it. And we can just come up here and add a new method, calling it toggle modal. And this toggle modal will be a function that simply will do this dot set state, and it will update is profile open to state dot is profile open. So it's just going to toggle it, true or false every time. Now, remember here, every time I'm touching state, and this should be this dot state, every time I'm touching state within a set state, that's a bit of a no-no because of the way React works. We want to always make sure that we use the function way of updating state, and that is to do something like this, and we can just wrap it in curly brackets so that we're returning this object. Previously, when we actually did this in the, I believe, sign in, or we did this in the profile icon, we left it like this. But what we actually want to do is return the full state that we want to update. And the way we do that is with a little bit of destructuring or spread operator. It is ... state. So right now I'm returning the entire state as well as updating whatever the current state is with the is profile open updated. Let's save this. And we'll get state is not defined because we have to update it to the parameter, previous state. And this has to be now previous state. All right. And I'm still getting profile is not defined, but again, because we don't have the component yet. But we want to pass the toggle modal method down to profile as well, because we can close the profile from the profile page, but we can also open it from our navigation page. I'm going to say this dot toggle modal. Let's save. And let's start creating our profile component. We have the ability to probably use this and close the modal, but also within the navigation where we do the profile icon, click, and then view profile with the drop-down menu, we're most likely going to need that as well. So I'm just going to add it on a new line just so it's a little bit cleaner. I'm going to say toggle modal, again, passing down the this dot toggle modal. All right, let's build out the profile component. I'm going to add a new file here to our profile folder. And this one is just going to be called profile.js. Now in profile.js, I'm going to import React from React. And we'll just do a stateless function. So we'll just say const profile is going to receive, what we have is profile open that we receive, I believe, if we go back, yeah, is profile open and toggle modal that we receive. So let's make sure that we have those. And within here, we're going to return some things. Now for now, I want to make sure that this is working. So I'm just going to say div, and let's say check, check. Or let's wrap it just to make sure that it's a string, check, check. Close the div. Make sure we export the profile. Let's save. And we also want to go back to app.js and make sure we're importing the profile component. So I'm going to add a profile from the profile folder. Let's save. See if we get any errors. Nothing yet. Let's go back to our app. If I click view profile, well, nothing happens. And that's because if we go to our React developer tools and we look at is profile open, when I click view profile, well, we're not toggling anything. Our profile is open is always false. But if I go back and just set our app.js is profile open to true, Go back. We see that is profile open is equal to true. And we open up our app. Uh-oh, look at that. We see our modal. And this modal has a profile component. And this profile component has a div check check. But our CSS is a little bit off and it's not showing, but we see that this is working. We just need to make sure that we can toggle it on and off. Let's work on that. I'm going to bring this back to false. And within the profile section, let's make it a little bit more interesting. I'm going to create a div with a class name of some styles that we'll get from Tachyons. Let's do a closed div. Just put this on a new line. And within here, let's actually add, what should we add? Well, I just want to make sure that the toggle modal is working. So let's just add a button. And this button, that will just say click. We'll have an on click function. We might not see the modal, so it might not work. We might have to add some CSS styles first, but let's give this a try. I'm going to say toggle modal. Let's actually add some proper CSS here so we can see this modal. I'm going to create a new CSS file. Let's do this first. Import profile.css. And let's add that CSS file now. And let's just have a profile modal class that will have a background color. Let's just make it a little bit see-through. Let's say 0.8 for opacity. We'll give it a position of fixed. Again, something that we'll definitely need. Let's give it a height of 100%. Perhaps a width as well of 100%. Top of 0. Left is 0. Lots of CSS. We'll also add a display of flex. We want to align the items. Again, we're just using Flexbox here to be centered. And finally, we want to also justify content center. Let's save here. Let's go back and actually, you know what? Instead of this class name, let me just change all of this to our class that we just created, which is profile modal. So I'll say profile modal. Let's go back. And I just realized with view profile, when we click, we want to make sure that we can toggle this on and off. So let's go back to our navigation here, where we click the view profile. So we have profile icon. And in the profile icon, when we click the view profile, we also want to have an onClick event. And this onClick event is going to have the this.props toggle modal. That's what I probably should have been doing from the beginning, but we make these mistakes every once in a while. Let's save. Make sure we get the toggle modal from profile icon. So let's go back to the navigation. Let's clean this up. It's getting a little bit messy once again. And starting off from the top, if we go to navigation, we see that in navigation we have this .toggle modal. So if we go to the navigation component in the profile icon, let's also pass down the toggle modal property. Let's give that a go. All right, if you look at the bottom here, it is doing something, it's toggling, but we get an error, not found. Failed to execute remove child on node. The node to be removed is not a child of this node. That is a confusing little error. But let's see what's going on here. I bet I made a silly mistake somewhere. And all right. Classic mistake. It's one of those things that when you're a developer, you just have to get used to and kind of embrace. You see over here that I completely misspelled component. And some of you are probably laughing right now because you're wondering why I spelled it that way. Well, hopefully that's the reason. Let's give it another try. Let's go to view profile. Hey, look at that. We have ourselves a modal that just has a click function for now, but this is nice. It's working. Very, very cool. Now, you saw how silly that was. That was just a simple error of spelling, but you don't really get any clear errors. It was hard to figure out what was going on, but just by looking at it, the fact that nothing was mounting the element, something was off. So that's why I decided to look at the modal.js, and of course, it was a spelling error. Now, I actually want to draw our attention to this file because I did gloss over a little bit on what this does. You see, a portal element in React inserts into the DOM tree after the modal's children are mounting. So that what we're doing here is we're mounting the modal component. If I go back over here, open up my developer tools. Let's go to React over here. If I look over here, as soon as I click view profile, I get the modal component. And as soon as I click off, the modal component is gone. And it's completely unmounted from here. And it's attached at the root to that HTML element that we created. Again, if we go to elements and we go to modal root, this is where our div was created that we have here. All right, now that we've gotten this far, we have ourselves a modal. Let's make it a little bit prettier in the next video so that we can start working on our sessions. I'll see you in that one. Bye-bye.